So thanks especially to the organizers of this conference. It's really exciting to be here in Edinburgh, and it's really exciting to be part of the program with so many great people on it. So I think we actually should give a hand to Adam and Orestes, especially right now. I also should thank my collaborator. This is a picture that we took when we had a Skype session with, you might recognize some of these people, Skype session with these folks. My collaborator on this project is Gus Skorburg. He's a graduate student in philosophy at the University of Oregon, and he's been working with me on the paper that's related to this talk. So I'll just get started. I think I probably don't need, this is what happens when you let Dave Chalmers put pictures online. I probably don't need to put too much work into establishing the background, but I'll make a few remarks. Right, so back in the previous millennium, Clark and Chalmers famously said that maybe not all cognitive processes are in the head. And one way of sort of motivating that idea is through the sort of functionalist argument that says, well, if you have something that's performing exactly the same function, which were it to occur in the brain, we would count as a cognitive process, then maybe that thing, even if it's outside the brain, should still count as a cognitive process, should count as a process that's part of that agent's mind. Since then, there's been lots and lots and lots of replies, and I'm not going to get into all of those, but one thing that I've been working on recently, sometimes in collaboration with Gus Skorburg, is this idea of extending not just the mind, but character. And it's sort of funny that we haven't seen this already in a way. If you're interested in explaining behavior, if you're interested in predicting behavior, if you're interested in controlling behavior and evaluating behavior, you want to know what someone's beliefs are, what someone's desires are, what someone's intentions are, but you probably also want to know what kinds of dispositions that person has. And those dispositions might turn out to be things like virtues and vices. So it stands to reason that if there's a good argument for saying that mental states or the mind extends, then perhaps there's an analogous argument for saying that character states, such as virtues and vices, also extend. In my first book, I argued that this is probably going to be the case for moral virtues. And in part, I was drawing on and responding to the so-called situationist challenge to virtue ethics in that book. And actually, in the last bit of that book, I talked about the possibility that intellectual character traits might extend as well. And since then, I've been working more on that idea. Here's a line from a more recent paper. It says, perhaps some people are curious all on their own, right? So their character doesn't extend. But if this line of reasoning is on the right track, in some cases, a person is curious because, among other things, she's suitably integrated with props, tools, or other people out with her brain and body. And I have to thank Duncan for teaching me the word out with, which I find extremely useful in talking about this stuff. So that would show, if it were correct, would show that character traits, including intellectual character traits like curiosity, extend. But you might think, well, what about the so-called reliabilist dispositions? Dispositions like heuristics, dispositions like cognitive processes that aren't necessarily things like curiosity that responsibilists talk about, not traits of character that motivate someone and that are praiseworthy or blameworthy, but rather just sort of low-level processes that may or may not be reliable. Could those extend as well? And I think the answer to that is, well, at least potentially yes. And what I'm going to talk about today is the so-called recognition heuristic. And I'm going to talk about the ways in which we might think that it is a cognitive process that extends into the world. I'm going to argue that it doesn't fit the criteria for full-fledged extension, but that it involves something more like scaffolding in the way that Kim Sterelny talks about it, which is somewhat close to the idea of embedding. So here's a quiz. I came from further up here. Think about San Diego, California, and San Antonio, California. Who thinks that San Diego has a larger population? And who thinks that San Antonio has a larger population? And a bunch of people don't know. So it turns out it's San Antonio. And if you, by just a little bit, and if you ask a bunch of Germans, they'll be better at guessing which city has a greater population than Americans. Sort of weird. You might think, well, are Germans just, better educated than Americans? Well, turns out they probably are. But in addition, Americans are better than Germans at saying which of two medium to large German cities is more populous. You might think, like, that's sort of weird. Here's another quiz. I just found out the answer to this one today. Which is more populous, Glasgow or Bradford, England? Who thinks it's Glasgow? And who thinks it's Bradford? It's just barely Glasgow. I didn't even know there was a thing called Bradford, England until this morning. So as an American, I could take advantage of my ignorance and say, well, I've heard of one of these two. I've heard of Glasgow. So probably it's bigger, because if it had been smaller, I probably wouldn't have heard of it in the first place. This is what's called the recognition heuristic, or an example of the recognition heuristic by Gigerenzer and his colleagues. And the basic idea is that when you're making a pairwise comparison on some important dimension, if you recognize one item in the pair and not the other, you infer that the one you've heard of, the one that you recognize, is bigger on that dimension, whatever that dimension might be. And the sort of underlying logic to it, which people may or may not realize they're employing, is that, well, if it's actually bigger, then it's more likely that I've heard of it. So if I have heard of it and not the other, then it's probably bigger, right? So you can make the sort of reverse inference. Here's a somewhat more troubling example. Okay, so we all know that this is the most bloody dictator of these three. But who thinks that Omar al-Bashir has killed more people, and who thinks that Saddam Hussein has killed more people in an act of democide, attacking his own people? Who thinks it's Bashir? And who thinks that it's Hussein? Right, so I imagine we've all at least heard of Saddam Hussein. Probably a lot of us haven't heard of Omar al-Bashir. He's the leader right now in Sudan. And the genocide, the democide in Darfur has killed roughly twice as many people as the democide that Hussein committed against his own people. So you might think, well, this recognition heuristic is awesome. It's great because we hear about the things that are bigger and more important, whether it be bigger cities, more prestigious universities, or more brutal dictators. And we don't hear about the things that are smaller. And so we can make inferences about what the world is like, even based on our own ignorance. But if what we hear about is filtered in certain ways, if it's filtered not just based on how big or important things are on important dimensions, but in various other ways, like nobody cares about what happens in Africa, then it turns out that you can't find out about things that are actually important. So that's sort of the guiding worry of this talk, that the recognition heuristic allows us to make really useful inferences based on our low-level capacity just to remember that we've seen something or encountered something before, whether it be someone's name or the name of a city or whatever, but that can get hijacked or that can get misdirected if what we tend to hear about is systematically filtered in such a way that things that are actually important don't show up to us, and maybe some things that aren't so important, like Justin Bieber and Katy Perry, do show up in our news feeds, as it were. Okay, so this is Goldstein and Gigerenzer's statement of the heuristic. It's actually phrased as an imperative, so it says, if one of two objects is recognized and the other is not, then infer that the recognized object has the higher value with respect to the criterion. Very abstract way of putting it. what the objects are could be cities, could be dictators, could be universities, could be any sort of thing. And then the criterion is sort of a crucial element here. The criterion is whatever dimension you're trying to make an inference about. So population, number of people killed, prestige, whatever it might be. And so obviously the choice of the criterion is going to determine the degree to which the recognition heuristic is reliable. So if the criterion variable is population of a city, then you might think, well, recognition is not so bad. If it's the multiplicative inverse of population, then actually the recognition heuristic is going to be unreliable because it's going to be inversely correlated with recognition. So the choice of variable matters quite a bit, and that in particular matters because there's a sort of basic mediation model that sort of underlies the idea behind the recognition heuristic. So the idea is, say, this is population, and we recognize the name of the city sometimes, and we don't recognize it, names of other cities sometimes. Well, why would that be? Well, there's some kind of mediation process. There's some intervening variable that helps us to recognize some things and not others. One way of thinking of that is just like news coverage. So, how many times is this city mentioned in the New York Times? How many times is it mentioned in Die Zeit? How many times is it mentioned on Facebook? How many times is it mentioned on Twitter? How many times is it mentioned by your friends? And so on. So exactly what the mediator is turns out to be slightly complicated, but you might think, well, these things are going to correlate with each other because if Die Zeit is talking about it, then probably the New York Times is talking about it. And if the New York Times is talking about it, probably your friends are talking about it, and so on. But the basic idea is that we don't have direct access to the criterion. Instead, we hear about it in some way through some kind of mediator and then recognize it. So here's kind of a cool thing that Gigerenzer found. He found that the correlation for population and number of mentions in the Chicago Tribune or Die Zeit was just gigantic. So the American to German correlation, so number of times mentioned in the Chicago Tribune and population of German city was 0.7, right? That's just an astonishingly high correlation for this kind of research. And actually the German one was even higher. The correlation between the population of American cities and the number of times they're mentioned in Die Zeit over the course of a decade was 0.72. And then similarly, if you actually just ask a bunch of participants, which of these cities do you recognize? The correlation, again, is just enormous. So the correlation here for Americans between the number of times that a German city is mentioned in the Chicago Tribune over the last decade and the proportion of people who recognize it is 0.86. It's just remarkable. And for Germans, it's a very similar thing, 0.79. So the way that the recognition heuristic works is that people obviously don't have any kind of control over this. Right? Ordinary people don't get to tell the Chicago Tribune or Die Zeit what to report on. And they don't really have control over this. I mean, you can choose which media you read from, but you can't choose which aspects of it you recognize later. Right? If you just run across a name, then you're probably going to remember it, or you're likely to remember it. And if you don't run across it, you certainly don't have a chance to recognize it. So this is all sort of external stuff, but if this external stuff is set up in the right way so that there are really high correlations between the criterion and the mediator on the one hand and between the mediator and people's capacity to recognize on the other, then there's going to be a high correlation between the criterion and recognition. So that's how that whole thing is supposed to work. But that means that we're sort of relying on this mediator to actually do a good job. And if we rely on it when it's not doing a good job, when, for instance, the ecological correlation is really low or even negative, then the recognition heuristic is not going to help us get any kind of knowledge. Here's sort of an example of how that can go wrong. So you ask a bunch of Americans, this was last summer, to find Ukraine on a map. And this is the heat map that's generated. I don't know what is going on with Greenland up there. It's really bizarre. Some people thought it was Iceland. You even have some people thinking it's Australia. And it turns out the less accurate they are, the more they want to intervene against Putin in Ukraine. It's sort of worrisome. So the worry is like, okay, if people are sort of just recognizing things in a haphazard way, then they're not going to be able to use the recognition heuristic to arrive at knowledge, and that's going to undermine their capacity to act in rational ways. So it's going to undermine both their epistemic and their practical rationality. So here's a question you might ask. Do outputs from the recognition heuristic count as knowledge? Well, Gigerenzer seems to think that they can. He says thinking does not happen simply in the mind, but in the interaction between the mind and its environment. That sounds awfully familiar to those of us who've thought about the extended mind debate. And as I point out in a forthcoming paper, most of the factors that make the recognition heuristic reliable, to the extent that it is reliable, are beyond both the ken and the control of the cognitive agent. As I said, we don't know how this works as ordinary people. We're not reporters, we're not journalists, we're not editors, and we're not necessarily in the know about this either. Some people might sort of make the conscious inference, like, well, if I recognized it, it's more important because I wouldn't have heard of it if it weren't important. But probably a lot of people do this at a sort of implicit level, and they're not actually making conscious inferences. Okay. So one thing to point out, I think I actually sort of jumped the gun on this slightly, is that it's not like there's only one mediator between population and recognition. It's not like everyone reads the Chicago Tribune. Probably fewer people should read the Chicago Tribune. It's really a rag. There's lots of potential mediators between, for instance, population and people's capacity to recognize cities. And crucially, I think, there's all kinds of feedback loops among these. So it's not like a simple model where there's a criterion, a mediator, and recognition. It turns out it's actually much more complicated than that, because if the Chicago Tribune is talking about it, that might lead the New York Times to talk about it. And if the New York Times is talking about it, that'll probably lead the Chicago Tribune to talk about it. And if the Chicago Tribune is talking about it, maybe it shows up on Facebook and Twitter. But of course, if it shows up enough on Facebook and Twitter, then the New York Times is going to talk about it, and so on. So there's feedback among the mediators, and there's also feedback from people's capacity to recognize potentially to both the mediators and the criterion. What do I mean by that? Well, the basic idea is like, if you recognize something, then you're gonna maybe go visit the city. Maybe you'll think of sending your kid to college there. Maybe you'll think about vacationing there, and so on. So actually what you recognize will end up influencing what goes on in that city. Maybe you contribute to its economy, it gets bigger. Or if you haven't heard of it, if most people haven't heard of it, they don't go visit, maybe its economy shrinks and it gets smaller. So there's actually feedback loops from people's capacity to recognize to the criterion in some cases, and there's probably feedback loops from people's capacity to recognize to the mediators as well, because of course the New York Times doesn't want to write their reportage on stuff that people aren't going to read, right? So they don't want to talk about stuff where people are like, I've never even heard of that city, why am I reading this? Right? You just turn the page. So it's not a simple model where there's a criterion which influences a mediator, which in turn influences people's capacity to recognize. There's feedback loops in all of these cases, or at least there's the potential for feedback loops in all of these cases. And you might think that that is going to influence the degree to which this kind of thing is reliable. Speaking of feedback loops, and that guy, I've found that Orestes' feedback loops idea is pretty persuasive in solving the coupling constitution problem for the extended mind hypothesis. The basic idea is that while an environment and an agent might have causal influences on each other, that doesn't necessarily demonstrate that they're coupled in the right way to constitute an extended mind. This is a worry that's due to Adams and Aizawa, among others. And Palermos argues, I think persuasively, that when there are sufficient feedback loops between the agent and the environment so that inputs to the agent are then fed back to the environment and inputs to the environment are fed back to the agent in a sort of continuous way, then we might think that there's reason to call that a case of extension. Now, it turns out that this is more complicated than you might want it to be. And that's led me and Gus to form a sort of taxonomy of different levels of extendedness. The basic idea here is if you've got a pair of systems, they can be either autonomous or non-autonomous. They count as autonomous when the parameters of one of them are not influenced by or constituted by states of the other. And they count as non-autonomous when the parameters of one, at least one, are influenced by or constituted by states of the other. Naturally, these are not going to be sufficiently coupled. But you might think then within the non-autonomous systems, there's different levels of coupling. You might have a system where the the parameters of one system are influenced by or constituted by the states of another, but not back in return, so a completely asymmetric kind of thing. And that would be something like, say, if somebody's good at recognizing cardinal directions based on where moss on a tree is. Right, so you've got this cognitive heuristic, you figure out where north is, assuming you're in the northern hemisphere, or south, if you're in the southern hemisphere, by looking at trees and you see, okay, well, the moss tends to grow on the north side of the tree in the northern hemisphere and the south side of the tree in the southern hemisphere. But there's no way that my knowing that or using that heuristic is going to influence where moss grows. Right? So there's no feedback from me to the environment. And I think that in cases like that, what we get at best is embedding, not extension. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got outright extension. This is my favorite example of extension. That's the Ceratothoa italica. It's a parasite related to the shrimp, which eats the tongue of a fish and then latches on and actually functionally replaces the tongue for the remainder of its life. Sort of a nice case of extension of like agency. Seriously, it's great. In this sort of case, you have the states of the fish being parameters for the parasite because, for instance, the blood oxygenation in the fish is going to influence what kind of nutrition the parasite gets. And the temperature of the fish is going to influence and actually determine pretty much the temperature of the parasite and so on. But the states of the parasite also function as parameters for the fish. Like the fish uses its parasite tongue in eating, right? So where the parasite is, how well it's attached, its orientation, and so on are going to be parameters for the fish. So that's, I think, if we could get something like that for ourselves, then we could have extended minds. So this is all we really want. But you might think, okay, well, that's asking for a lot, and probably there aren't going to be that many people who are going to sign up for it. So there's also what I think is usefully called scaffolding by Kim Sterelny, and I think the recognition heuristic fits this kind of paradigm. In a case like this, you have highly imbalanced parametric coupling. So there's a little bit of influence in one direction and a whole lot of influence in the other direction. So think, for instance, of news coverage of what's happening in far-flung locations. In general, people are just going to sort of find out about things and not influence the coverage themselves. But there are some groups and people that go to great lengths to influence what gets talked about in the media, for instance, ISIS. we've all heard of ISIS. Why have we heard of ISIS? Because they make explicit efforts to influence what goes on in the media through their sort of ultra-violent videos. And that in turn means that we know about them and probably end up assessing them as much higher on various criteria than we should. Right? So we probably think of them, for instance, as more dangerous than they are because we've heard of them, and other things as less dangerous than they are because we haven't heard of them. So people can sort of monkey with the recognition heuristic by messing with the media. In cases like this, there's a certain amount of influence from the things that get recognized on the mediators, and there's also an influence back in the other direction from recognition onto the criterion. So it turns out that these ultra-violent videos have been really good at recruitment. And that means that more people are joining ISIS, which means that they're able to be more violent. Okay, so I think of this as a kind of scaffolding. Why scaffolding? So this is Sterelny's summary of the idea. He's a charming guy. The scaffolded mind hypothesis, according to him, proposes that human cognitive capacities both depend on and have been transformed by environmental resources. Often these resources have been preserved, built, or modified precisely because they enhance cognitive capacity. So if we think back to this kind of model, the agents of cognitive agents actually have some influence on how the media works, and we want our newspapers and our various other media to work in a certain way so that we can recognize things and use the recognition heuristic. That's sort of the main idea. But that means that it's also susceptible to misuse or susceptible to being hijacked. How am I doing for time here? Okay, I'll speed up a little bit. Okay, so finally, to connect this up with the idea of epistemic injustice, epistemic injustice is a concept that was sort of first developed by Miranda Fricker at Sheffield. Here's one way of thinking about epistemic injustice that we've come up with. So if knowledge is generated through the recognition heuristic, or at least it can be generated through the recognition heuristic when it's well-functioning and reliable, and the external factors that constitute the recognition heuristic are biased in some way, then the use of that heuristic may produce biased knowledge or may fail to produce knowledge. Another way of putting the idea. So why does that matter? Well, we make inferences of the sort that Sandy Goldberg talks about, like if X were true, I would have heard of it by now. We also think if X were important, I would have heard of it by now. And that's sort of the guiding inference for the recognition heuristic. So Fricker defines epistemic injustice as a distinctively epistemic kind of injustice. It's a wrong done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. And she distinguishes a number of types of epistemic injustice. She's especially interested in harms to a speaker as a giver of knowledge rather than a possessor of knowledge. Right? So she's specifically interested in cases of testimonial injustice, where one person's word is either given too much credit, which she calls a credibility excess, or too little credit, which she calls a credibility deficit. She's much more concerned with deficits, though I do think that excesses are interesting in their own right. If you follow sort of William James in thinking that the epistemic agent has sort of two competing injunctions, believe the true and avoid believing the false, then people who are given a credibility excess will find it difficult to satisfy that second one because no one will tell them they're wrong. So they end up with a lot more false beliefs than they would if people didn't give them a credibility excess. This occurred to me recently when I was reading some stuff by Josh Green. The credibility deficit, on the other hand, is what Fricker talks about, and she's specifically interested in cases where someone is given too little credence because of some social identity that they have, their race, their gender, that kind of thing. And she's she says that there's a subtype of this, which she calls silencing. And what happens with silencing is that instead of someone making an assertion and then it not being taken seriously, they don't get to make an assertion in the first place because the assumption is that they've got nothing important to say. I actually think that that's not really usefully understood as a credibility deficit, because there's, I think, an important distinction between looking someone in the eye, telling them something, and them shrugging, and on the other hand, just never being able to say something in the first place. And if the recognition heuristic gets hijacked, if the recognition heuristic gets monkeyed with in various ways, then certain people are not going to be able to say something in the first place because no one will ever have heard of them, no one will ever have heard of where they are, no one will ever have heard of their group. Like, I hadn't known there was such a thing as the Yazidi tribe until last year. So thinking a little bit more about outright silencing, here's a few quotes from Fricker. She says, a significant form of the injustice in the epistemic state of nature occurs when prejudice leads to a tendency for some groups simply not to be asked for information in the first place. And to me, that doesn't sound like a credibility deficit. It's not like there's some absolute level that they should, of credence that they should be given, and they're slightly below that. They're just not even on the map. And then here she says, also on the same page, purely structural operations of identity power can control whose would-be contributions become public and whose do not. I think of this as a surprisingly prescient, as it were, way of describing what happens with the recognition heuristic. Fricker, so far as I know, hasn't worked on the recognition heuristic, but this, I think, is a really good description of the worry that you might have about it, that no one's really trying to enact some kind of prejudice against people in, say, sub-Saharan Africa in the news coverage. Maybe some people are, but supposing even that they're not, there's still ways that these structural operations of power can lead to reduced or non-existent coverage. There's just almost no coverage of what's happening in Sudan, for instance, or the Congo. And then here on the next page of her book, she says, this form of injustice may be especially hard to detect from the outside, for it's by definition literally passed over in silence. If we turn our imagination to the real social world and place the phenomenon of preemptive testimonial injustice, so she sort of redefines it here as preemptive rather than credence deficit testimonial injustice in relations of social power, we readily see how it could function as a mechanism of silencing. Now, I think she's right that it's very hard to detect, but that if we use various tools from the sort of data mining community, we can actually start to look at that. So you'll recall that Gigerenzer and Goldstein have this remarkable work on ecological and surrogate correlations, where the ecological correlation is the correlation between the size of a city and the number of mentions in some big newspaper, either the New York Times or Chicago Tribune or Die Zeit. And the surrogate correlation is the correlation between the number of mentions in one of these newspapers and the proportion of people who recognize the city. So I figured, okay, well, they've only worked on Germany and the United States, and that's sort of cute, and they call that an international replication, but you might think, like, okay, this is not really truly international. So I did some truly international stuff. I picked some countries in different continents and grabbed all of the cities that fit Goldstein and Gigerenzer's parameters. So they look at cities that have a population of at least 100,000. And there's 81 such cities in Germany, 67 in Turkey, 42 in Argentina, and so on. And I correlated the populations of these cities with the number of times they were mentioned in the New York Times in the first decade of the 21st century. And I actually found some pretty nice correlations. So like Germany, 0.83, that's even better than Goldstein and Gigerenzer found. Turkey, not quite so good. Thailand off the charts. I mean, you just don't see correlations of 0.98. That's ridiculous. But then there was this worrisome thing that the worldwide correlation, when you just throw everything together, is only 0.19. So that got me worrying that maybe there's something more complicated going on here. And so I took away just the top city in each country. So you take away Berlin, you take away Istanbul, you take away Buenos Aires, take away Bangkok and Lagos from Nigeria, and all of a sudden, the correlations just collapse. I was thinking like, oh, that's worrisome. That probably suggests that this isn't the kind of data where you want to run linear correlations. And that got me thinking about what's called Anscombe's quartet. Anscombe was a statistician back in the 70s. He came up with these 4 data sets that have the same mean, the same variance, the same correlation, and the same regression line, but that clearly aren't all accurately characterized by a linear regression. So this is a nice sort of scatter plot with a beautiful linear regression for it. This one has the same mean, variance, correlation, and regression line, but if you just look at it, you see it's got to be a quadratic function. It's not actually a linear function. Here's another one where the correlation is overestimated. It's fairly clear that it should be a lower positive correlation, but that this one outlier is dragging things up. And then this is the kind of thing you really don't want to have, where there's really nothing going on except this one outlier determines everything. So just showing that you can establish a linear correlation is not nearly enough to show that something interesting is going on. And I started to worry that maybe some of this was going on with the cities recognition task that Goldstein and Gigerenzer use and that I tried to replicate. So I did some exploratory graphical analysis. Here's Germany. You see there's a lot of cities down here. And then here's Berlin. Correlation of 0.83. That's a legit correlation, right? Here's Thailand. 0.98. Kick-ass correlation, except for everything's down here except Bangkok. Here's Turkey. Actually, not quite as bad. This is the city of Van. Unfortunately, I was not able to run a case-sensitive search, so any mention of Turkey and a van was showing up. So that actually had to be taken out. Here's Argentina. You might think, well, is that actually a correlation of 0.77? There's Buenos Aires. And here's Nigeria. There's Lagos up there. There's the new capital, the sort of designed capital, Abuja. And then here's everything else down here. Is that really a correlation of 0.86? You might think not. And this is what happens when you throw everything together in a single linear model from around the world. You've got basically everything down here and then Berlin. So I was thinking like, okay, maybe the recognition heuristic isn't quite all it's cracked up to be. Here's what happens when you take out the top outliers from each data set. So if you do Germany without Berlin, you actually still have a pretty decent looking correlation. If you take Bangkok away from Thailand, there's just nothing going on there. If you take out Van and Istanbul, it's actually not so bad. For Turkey, take out Buenos Aires, not so bad. Take out Lagos, not so good. Actually, the worldwide correlation goes up. And that shouldn't be that surprising, I guess, because if Berlin was doing all the work and what you want is to look at the whole data set and not just Berlin, then you should expect that taking out that outlier would actually help with the worldwide correlation. So I thought, all right, well, except for Thailand, all of these are still positive. They're not quite as impressive as they seemed at first, like correlation of 0.98, but they're not terrible. So what happens when we do the same thing with the surrogate correlation? So again, this is the correlation between the number of times the city is mentioned in the first decade of the 21st century in the New York Times and the proportion of 72 University of Oregon undergraduates who recognize the city, or at least claim to recognize the city. So if you look at the Germany data set, you've got this, and then you've got Berlin. If we look at the Thailand data set, we've got this, and then we've got Bangkok, 0.99. That's a beautiful correlation. Here's Turkey, again, maybe not such a great data set. Here's Argentina, again, maybe you think this isn't really a 0.87. And here's Nigeria. You'll notice in most of the cities in Nigeria were both not mentioned a single time in the New York Times in the course of a decade, and that no one had heard of them. A bit worrisome. Here's what happens with the world, yeah, this is the world correlation for the surrogate correlation. So again, Berlin's doing all of this work. So you might think, well, how good is the recognition heuristic at getting us knowledge if the media we use are so biased? Can we actually acquire knowledge in this scaffolded way from the recognition heuristic if basically all you ever hear about is Berlin? Well, here's what happens when you take out the top outliers. They're actually all still positive. So it's not all bad news, but it's still maybe not the most beautiful data set that you've ever seen. That got me thinking, well, maybe linear correlations just aren't the right way to think about what's going on. In fact, there's a well-known law called Zipf's law that characterizes, among other things, city populations. And what it says is basically that there's a power curve that fits populations rather than a linear curve that fits them. So if you take the biggest city in a country and then go to the next biggest city, it'll usually be roughly half as populous. And you go to the third biggest city, it'll be half as populous as the second. And the fourth will be roughly half as populous as the third. And okay, I can't do degrees of powers of two in my head that long. But if you take the logarithm of population, you get this beautiful linear curve, right? Because the logarithm is the inverse of the power function. I thought it might be even easier just to take the ordinal rankings of population rather than the actual population. So I reran everything with ordinal rankings, where a city is just one up the ranking regardless of how much bigger it is. And actually, if you do that, you start to get these beautiful curves. Like in Germany, right, it's not as high a correlation, but if you look at that scatter plot, that actually looks perfectly reasonable. Similarly for Turkey, that's a perfectly reasonable scatter plot. And actually for the world, okay, well, poor Nigeria is not getting covered, which means that you've got all these things down here that aren't really doing anything, all these cities that no one recognizes and have never been spoken of in the New York Times in an entire decade, but you still do have something going on. And this is what happens with the ordinal rankings for the surrogate correlation. So this is mentions in the Times versus, correlated with people's recognition rather than city population. And again, they're all positive except maybe Nigeria's could be just a no correlation or even a negative correlation. So it looks like while Gigerenzer and Goldstein are sort of overplaying their hand a bit, they're onto something. And you might think that if we want to harness the recognition heuristic, which seems to be one of our sort of most basic cognitive heuristics, and probably not something that we can stop using even if we want to, then what we need to do is extend our control over our epistemic domain out into our environment and get the media to report more sort of faithfully about what's going on in the world. Not faithfully in the sense of telling the truth, but faithfully in the sense of talking about things that are important and not talking too much about things that are less important. Because we can't help but use the recognition heuristic to decide what things are important and what things aren't, which means that we're going to end up committing acts of epistemic injustice if we fail to recognize things that are important or if we over-recognize things that aren't important. Here's another look. It's kind of illegible, isn't it? I'm going to skip those two, actually, because I think I'm out of time anyway. Thanks for your attention.